Hello, I'm the Reverend Kirk Thomas, and this is the second workshop in the series on cosmology and religion that I am making to send into prisons. Now, this particular one is on the sacred center, something very important in religion. Sometimes when wandering around in the world, one runs across a place or an object that just seems different somehow. Maybe in this place the air feels different. Maybe the light is odd. And very often there's a sense of otherness to that place. It may not last for a long time, this feeling, but it could. And these sorts of places were very honored in the ancient world. These places were considered sacred. Now, what does the word sacred actually mean? Now, it comes from the Proto-Indo-European root sek, S-E-K, which means to cut, or to cut away from, or to cut away from ordinary reality. And in addition to this, into some descendant languages, there are additional meanings that are added to the word that comes from sek. In Latin, of course, it's sacer, which means sacred. In Tocharian B, the Tocharians were an Indo-European people who lived in the far northwest of China. It also meant happy to them. And in the Hittite language, which is from Central Asia Minor, what's modern Turkey, it also meant right or custom. So the meanings for sacred can include joy, religious rituals, and being cut off from ordinary reality. Now there's another word that you may hear, holy, which many people confuse with sacred, and they're not the same thing. Holy is a connection with the divine, and sacred, of course, is a place or object that appears to be cut off. So you could think of sacred as that place or feeling where the holy can manifest. This brings to mind a big word, Hierophany, which essentially means the holy coming down and into our world and creating holiness, which automatically creates a sacred space around it. Okay? Because of this, and in addition to this, there were two ancient meanings to the word sacred. One was positive and one was negative. The positive, of course, is charged with divine presence. And the negative one is what is forbidden for people to contact or to touch. You see, the sacred can be uplifting and terrifying at the same time, as can the holy. So, I'm going to tell you a tale. Now, this is personal experience, and so I have to explain something first. There is this concept in the pagan world, the initials of which are UPG, and you may hear this a lot, especially from other pagans. And it stands for Unverified Personal Gnosis. Gnosis, what is Gnosis? Gnosis is like a knowing, that it just comes to you. This knowing does. An unverified personal part means that it's yours only, and it's unverified. You can't prove it from anything. It's not in the lore. It isn't anything else. It's your personal experience. I think one good example of this is of someone I know who has a different sort of relationship with the Irish goddess, the Morrigan. Now, the Morrigan is a goddess of war, death, and destruction. That's what we know about her. A modern interpretation of her is that she is also a goddess of transformation, but that's modern, that's not ancient. Well, this person I know, this guy I know, has got an almost sexual relationship with her. He sort of sees her as a lover. Now, it is true that the Morrigan has sex with the Dagda over the River Unius during the night before the Second Battle of Moytura. And it is also true that she definitely tried to get into Cahulan's pants and failed. To Cahulan's dire fate. But she's not really seen as a goddess of love. I mean, we'd sort of have other goddesses that you would ascribe that to. But that's how he sees her. Fair enough. If that's how she came to him, if that's how she revealed herself to him, then who am I to say he's wrong? The only thing is about UPG, though, is that it applies to you, and it doesn't necessarily apply to anybody else. If you go out there and tell the world that, yes, the Morrigan is a goddess of love, you're going to get a lot of pushback. And you'll get people saying things like, cite your sources, and all the rest of this. But if you say, my UPG is, for me, that the Morrigan is a love goddess, then we'll all say, okay, if that works for you. You understand? So, I'm going to tell you a story. This is my UPG, and it's about the sacred being uplifting and terrifying at the same time. Some years ago, I was in Wales visiting my relatives in Llandybia in Carmarthenshire, and there's a castle nearby. It's like 3 miles away. It's not very far. And I've been there many, many times. Now, this castle sits on a rocky knoll, and in the side of this great rock that it sits upon is a cave, a rather deep and dark cave. Now, when they built the castle, it may have been a Welsh king who built it, but it was later taken over by the English and then finally destroyed during the English Civil War. But this castle, Carrickkennen Castle, when it was first built, was included the cave in its defenses. Well, you want to keep people out of that cave if they're besieging you. I mean, especially once we invented gunpowder, someone could go load it up with gunpowder and blow up the whole place. So, you understand. They wanted to include it in the defenses. So, you go into this ruined castle, and you can go down a flight of steps and enter the cave. Luckily, at the farmstead down below, where you pay to get your ticket to go in this place, they also rent flashlights, torches, as the British say. And I rented one this time. I was there with my cousin from Llandybia, and she and I went to the castle, and because it was February, there was nobody else there. Now, every other time I'd been there was in the summer or the spring or the fall, and there were always lots of people around. But this was a cold, windy, kind of damp day, and there was nobody there. And my cousin did not want to go down into the cave. She just wasn't comfortable doing it. So I said, okay. And I'd been in there alone before, more or less. I mean, other people wandering around, but it didn't bother me. So I go down the stairs and I enter the cave. And I am suddenly hit with this incredible feeling of otherness. I mean, my hair stood on end. It was really strange. Something was there. And I really needed to get to the end because I was going to exchange a small piece of silver bead, for a small pebble that I could take back to put in my stone circle here in Trout Lake. And so I started walking into the cave, and it's dark with my flashlight trying to see my way and not break my leg and stepping into a hole or something. And I'm crawling through this cave, and it's getting heavier and heavier. And so what I decided to do was start singing, and I started singing ADF chants at the top of my lungs to keep my courage up, to be honest with you. This was an amazing feeling, terrifying, but at the same time uplifting. I felt like I was connected to something greater than myself. I managed to get to the end. I found a little crack somewhere where I could hide that piece of silver, and I found a pebble lying on the floor, and I took that and sang my way back out. I didn't want to run. I wasn't going to admit that I was scared, but I was terrified. And I walked slowly and calmly and sang at the top of my lungs until I got to the end of the cave. And then as I started going up the steps, the feeling just kind of fell away. By the time I got to the top, it was gone. The thing is, in this cave, I could still see the walls of the cave. I mean, with my flashlight dim glow, I could still see the walls, but it was as though, sort of like they were made out of glass. I was aware that there was more beyond the walls. The walls were there, but they weren't solid, really. It was a weird, weird thing. I was in the midst of the holy. I believe that a hierophany of holiness of something, I don't know what, perhaps the Earth Mother, perhaps ancestors, sacred dead, or maybe even a chthonic deity, somebody else was there with me. And I've been there since, and I've never experienced it again. But that one time, in that place, by myself, I experienced it. Yes, the sacred. Well, there's a scholar named Mircea Eliade. He's a scholar of religion, and he sort of came up with a schema. Well, if you have sacred, then what isn't sacred? What would he call that? He called it the profane. You could call it the ordinary, whatever you like. But we have the sacred and we have the profane. And the profane is the everyday stuff. And the sacred is that which is other. Now, since I just said there's the sacred and the profane, which are two different things, that implies that the sacred has limits, that perhaps there is a boundary between the two. Now, in ADF rituals back in the day, years and years ago, people used to say that the sacred was that which was lit by our fire, and where the light of our fire no longer reached would be the edge and the end of the sacred. Okay? A lot of pagans cut circles in ritual. They go through it and magically cut a circle which they see sort of as a container to contain their magic. But, there's also strong examples, especially from the ancient world, of the sacred having boundaries, and that would be the walls of temples, or perhaps the walls surrounding the sacred precinct of a temple. And you have those all over the place, everywhere. Very often in Northern Europe, at least, instead of building walls around these temples, they would do a ditch and a bank, with the bank on the outside. If the bank is on the outside, it's a sacred precinct. If the bank is on the inside, it could very well be defensive, because that way, the enemy has to go through the ditch before they can get to the bank, to get to the fence on top of the bank, etc. You understand? So boundaries can be physical, but they can also be metaphysical. They can also be religious. So one thing that very often people do for ritual is they will start somewhere, and then they will take a procession to wherever the ritual is going to take place. Very often singing chants or songs or something, right? These processions are a way of going from profane space into sacred space. And the mere fact of always doing a procession before you go into ritual, what that does is it sort of sets it up inside your mind that we are now heading into sacred space. Now, there's another word that I want to cover real quickly to make this a little more clear. And that word, and there are two Latin words, essentially, that I've got to deal with. The one, of course, sacer, which means sacred. And the other one is sanctus. Now, sanctus is not sacer. It is not the natural state of sacer. And, of course, sanctus is not profane or ordinary either. So what is it? You see, sanctus is the result of some operation, something that protects from assault, and which is backed up by divine punishment. And a clear way to think about this is the English word sanctuary, which comes from sanctus. Sanctuary is a place where you are safe. In the Middle Ages, churches were considered sanctuaries, and if you took refuge in a church, then supposedly the law couldn't get you. In religious terms, sanctuary is a safe place where you can worship the gods. So the sanctus is the boundary which surrounds the sacred. Now, sacred space is the center of all the worlds. This place where the holy can manifest is a place where all the worlds touch. The underworld, the midworld, the heavens, they all can touch in there. And because they can touch, we can have communication between the worlds. When you are at the sacred center, in sacred space, you can communicate with the gods and spirits easily. And in group ritual, this is what's very important. An individual can go into a sacred space simply by sitting quietly and going into trance and opening oneself to it. But when you have a group, that's hard to do because everybody doesn't have the same skills, etc. And so you need to recreate or create the first time sacred space. Now there is an image, there is a thing in the ancient world that connects all the worlds in sacred space. And this thing is called the Axis Mundi, or the axis of the worlds. Now another word for it is the cosmic pillar. Now axis does mean center, so our world surrounds it, so it is in the middle or the navel of the earth. And this Axis Mundi can be seen as trees or mountains or columns or even stones. Now, I'll give you some examples here. In ancient Saxony, in pre-Christian Saxony, there were these trees. They were called Irminsul. Irminsul is a single. These trees which may have been cut down and then stood up in the open air in the middle of a field or in the middle of their sacred place. And they were essentially worshipped. There's a 9th century text that refers to the Irminsul as the column of the universe holding up all things. Now, Irminsul also comes from the name of the god Irmin, who many religious scholars believe is the same as Tiwaz, better known in the Norse mythology as Tyr. Now, speaking of the Norse, there's another example, and that's Yggdrasil. Many of you have heard of Yggdrasil. It's the great tree whose branches stretch out over heaven and earth alike. And it has 3 roots which reach into the 3 worlds. Now, in the Prose Edda, we can read, "Then spoke Gangleri, where is the chief center or holy place of the gods? And Hai replied, it is at the Ash Yggdrasil. There the gods must hold their courts each day." Now later, Hai says that Yggdrasil's branches stretch out over all the world and extend across the sky. And later, in other places, it says that Yggdrasil has 3 roots. One goes to the Aesir, one goes to the frost giants, and it's under that root that we live, and one goes to Niflheim. See, at the center is Midgard, which is enclosed by walls to keep out those frost giants, and that's where mankind lives. Midgard, the middle guard. Now, in Vedic India, the Axis Mundi is seen as a cosmic pillar, and in one place in the Rig Veda, it's compared to a chariot axle. "For Indra I have raised my songs, like waters in restless surges from the depths of the sea, for him who propped asunder earth and heaven with his powers, like wheels with an axle." And later in the Rig Veda, it refers to it propping up the sky. "Who made firm the wavering earth? Who settled the quaking mountains? Who gave the mid-space wider measure? Who propped up the heaven? He, O peoples, is Indra." Now, also in Vedic India, there is a Soma rite called the Vajrapaya. And in this rite, they have something called a Yupa. Now, the Yupa is like a post, a big post, in which to which they normally tie the sacrificial animal before they kill it, right? But after the animal has been sacrificed, a great big ladder is leaned up against the Yupa. Now, in Vedic ritual, the Brahmins, the priests, would actually perform the ritual, but the benefit of the ritual was not for the priests. It was for the the man and his wife who paid for this ritual. He's the sacrificer. So once that ladder is placed up, the sacrificer and his wife would climb the ladder. And at the top of this post was a dough wheel. And when their heads were at the height of the dough wheel, the sacrificer would say, "We have gone to the light, O gods." And then they'd keep climbing up a little bit higher so that their heads were above the dough wheel, at which point they would say, "We have become immortal." This is definitely an Axis Mundi. This is them climbing to heaven. Now, in Persia, the center of the worlds was considered to be a mountain called Hierophany. Now, in Greece, on the other hand, the center of the worlds was marked by a stone. The myth goes that Zeus sent 4 eagles, one from each of the directions, flying towards the center of the worlds, and where they met would be the center. And that center is Delphi. And at Delphi, there is this great stone, which was considered to be the navel of the worlds. Now, going to the Celtic world, one has to remember that the Romans could never tell the difference between the Gauls and the Germans. They never could. So the boundary between Roman Gaul and Germania, wild, free Germania, was essentially the Rhine River. And at one point early on, during the reign of Augustus, they also controlled areas to the east of the Rhine River, but after the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, they were wiped out and they retreated back behind the Rhine. But in this Rhineland area, pre-Roman as well as during the Roman times, you would see these things the Romans called Jupiter pillars. Now this would be a large pillar, and it would be surrounded by a wall, a precinct wall, a boundary, and in one specific case, one of the pillars has carved oak leaves and acorns on it. And at the top of these pillars, there was usually a statue. And this statue would be a god on horseback, wielding a spear or a sword, attacking and killing a monster under the hooves of that horse. And this monster very often had snake-like attributes. The thing that this really reminds me of is that back in Vedic India, the god Indra had to battle the monster Vrtra, because that was the only way that Vrtra could be forced to release the waters. Now, release the waters, what does this mean? It could very well mean release all the rains so that they can come and water the crops of the people. But releasing the waters is releasing the good things that Vrtra, the evil monster, had hoarded away for himself and wouldn't let anyone have. If you want an example of a modern one that you may have heard of, based on the Indo-European idea of the hoarding dragon, just remember Smaug in The Hobbit. That is an Indo-European dragon. And he releases the water. So what do we have in the Rhineland in Gaul? We have a god with thunder attributes, a sword or a spear, killing a monster on top of a column that has got oak leaves and acorns on it, the oak tree being sacred to the thunder god. I just find that to be an amazing parallel myself. Now, another Irish one that you may have heard of, or another Celtic one in Ireland, is the Stone of Divisions, which is in Uisneach, which is a mound, a hill, a big hill, in the center of the country. The Stone of Divisions is also called the Cat Stone because it kind of looks like a crouching cat. And I know it's still there because I have seen it. Now, the Stone of Divisions stands at the place where 5 ancient provinces of Ireland all touched. So it was the center of the provinces of Ireland. It was the center of the world. And also, just as a side note, there's a later tale that talks about this great monstrous tree that used to grow upon the hill of Uisneach. And this tree fell over, and when it fell over, it was measured, and it was 20 miles long. So it was one grand tree. Now going from the Axis Mundi back to sacred space, in which the Axis Mundi stands. We said before that sacred space is marked out space. Definitely, if it has a boundary, it has to be marked out. It could be marked out by the Hierophany itself, when the holy invades our world and creates this sacrality in which it can exist. So it need not be marked out by us. It can be marked out by the gods or by the holy. So sacred space is a metaphysical and religious space. It isn't necessarily a physical place, although it can be a physical place. But the fact that it's a metaphysical or religious space means that when we are there, we are in the center of our world. Now, you see, the sacred can exist in multiple spaces at the same time. I mean, well, just a common example to that would be that Rome or Greece or Celtia or somewhere may have had a bunch of shrines or temples or sacred streams or sacred ponds and lakes or sacred rivers or whatever. And guess what? They all exist at the same time, don't they? So you can be in sacred space, in your world, in the center of your world, at the same time that somebody else is in theirs. You could be in Seattle, in sacred space, in ritual, at the same time that somebody in New York is also in sacred space, in their world. And the two don't necessarily touch or even have to touch. Okay? So multiple sacred spaces or objects can exist at the same time. And a group, of course, can be in sacred space together in the same space. Okay? That's where we go in our rituals. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is sacred time. We talked about sacred space. What about sacred time? See, profane time, ordinary time, is linear, right? It has a beginning and a middle and an end. For example, you wake up in the morning and you get up and you get dressed and you have breakfast and then you go to work and then you come home and you have dinner and then you do whatever you do, watch TV or whatever, and then you go to bed over and over and over again. There's a beginning, a middle, and an end. And indeed, we look at time in our normal world as having a beginning, a middle, and an end. It just seems that way, you know, that we're going straight from A to B to C to D to E, just straightforward. The thing is, sacred time is circular. Now, pagans understand this to a certain extent, much better than others, simply because of the wheel of the year. We know that the wheel of the year goes round and round, you know? Samhain is followed by winter solstice, is followed by Imbolc, is followed by spring equinox, is followed by Beltane, is followed by summer solstice, is followed by Lunasa, is followed by autumn equinox, is followed by Samhain again, and now we go round the circle again. See, time is circular. And as a result of this, we can consider it a break in normal time. A little example. If you've ever been on a long driving trip, you ever been driving down the highway and suddenly realize that you don't remember the last 20 miles that you drove because you were in a trance, a driving trance. We spend much of our lives in trance, but the trance was a break in normal time when you were unaware of its linear quality, right? The other thing about sacred time is that in sacred time, we may be living some primordial event. An example, when the god Lu, the Irish god Lu, started the first Lunasa, the first great rite of funeral games to honor his foster mother Talcha, this event, these games, this Lunasa was placed in sacred time because a god did it, okay? And when we celebrate Lunasa, We are in the same time stream as Lu was and is. So time takes on a different meaning. It's as though one Lunasa is the same as all Lunasas when we are in sacred space and sacred time. We are in all space and all time. Now, I also said before that the definition of sacred, coming from sek in the Proto-Indo-European, in some descendant languages also meant joy or happy. Now, how is this possible? It's possible through the idea of play. Now, play is irrational, but we all do it. Play can be serious, but it doesn't have to be. Play is free. It's kind of a freedom, but play exists apart from our ordinary lives. Play isn't real life because we step out of the ordinary for this special activity of whatever that play is. I mean, it could be doing games on the internet. It could be doing board games in your house. It could be just playing around outside and laughing and hollering and carrying on. But it doesn't matter. It's when you're playing that you are doing a special activity that is not part of real life. Because when we play, we are living in the moment. And we are cut off from that ordinary reality. I've got an example for you. Have you ever visited a playground and stood outside and watched, and all these kids are running around, blah, 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 you know, kids are, oh my God, all running around, and it looks pretty chaotic. Like, you know, God, they're not doing anything specific. They're just running around. But if you look closely, you might see that they actually do have rules to what they're doing. If they're playing a game like King of the Mountain or something, they have rules. And they are following these rules that may not be apparent to us, but they understand what they are. They're creating in play like a magical illusion of what it is they're doing, just like we do whenever we play ourselves, right? And anybody who doesn't follow the rules is breaking that magical illusion, and as a result, very often they get kicked out or called a spoil sport. So in ritual, we want all the participants to engage with this sacred activity. And the way we do that is the same way you do it in play, is we have to suspend our disbelief. You gotta, get swept up in it so that it can be fun. And if you really get swept up in it and you suspend your disbelief, you can rise above mere fun and enter into the sacred and the holy. And that's what we try to do in our rituals. You see, everybody has to buy into this idea. If they don't, the ritual won't work and you won't rise into the sacred. And so that's why the sacred center and sacred time and sacred play are so important. Thank you.